guys, hope you guys did well on the protist and fungi material. I know you guys just took that quiz over the lab material. We are now going to move forward into our last unit for DC Bio. I know that's got to sound good. So our very last unit is going to be two kingdoms. We're going to have Kingdom Plantae and Kingdom Animalia. We could split these into two separate units, but I really don't want to test you to death right there at the very end. And so we're going to join the Kingdom Plantae and Kingdom Animalia test into one. And so we're going to have a few sets of notes over plants, and then we're going to take a quiz. We're going to have a few sets of notes on animals, and then we're going to be gearing up for our final unit test of the year. So just keep it up, keep going strong. Just a little bit more to go, guys. So this particular lesson is going to be about plant diversity and structure, and so there's actually a lot of material over plants, and over the years of teaching it, I tried to kind of reduce it and focus on the most important things. You're going to be getting a study guide, and honestly, if you really want to practice, each section of the study guide is kind of broken down along with the notes. So like there's a section on plant diversity and the different plant groups, there's a section on plant structure, there's different diagrams, there's many different things that can help you. So I would encourage you to take a look at that study guide as you're studying this material. So we're going to start off with just some basics about Kingdom Plantae. So, one thing that I think as an overall understanding you need is what makes a group a group. So like what made a prokaryote, bacteria or archaea, what made a protist, a fungus. And so what actually makes a plant a plant? And so these are some of the main characteristics of this particular kingdom. So we can see that they are multicellular. This is one of the things that separates some of those algae groups in that, let's see, I didn't do that right. All right, so some of your algae groups are unicellular, and a lot of times your algae may be placed with your protist category, the ones that we call the plant-like protist or the algae. They definitely are all eukaryotes. Remember, everything that we're covering now is in domain eukarya. For the most part, plants are terrestrial, and there was definitely some evolutionary benefit for moving onto land. Plants thrive better where there's more sunlight and better soils and more carbon dioxide. Here's a very important one. One of the things that we've seen over and over again is the importance of the cell wall structure. And so for plants, they have something called cellulose. We actually looked at this back when we did our macromolecules and we looked at polysaccharides. So like fungi have chitin and plants have cellulose. That's a major difference between the two, okay? Another major difference between fungi and plants is that fungi are heterotrophic and plants are autotrophic. Typically they are photosynthetic. They are able to capture sunlight and create food. And they are believed to have come from a green algae group known as the charophytes millions of years ago. And so there's some similarities that those charophytes have. And we'll take a look at some of these structures as we go through structures in plants. Now, this is something that I just want to add just a little bit of blurb. You probably saw back in the protist that plant-like protists are known as algae. A few years ago when I was studying up, trying to, just kind of refresh and look at some different material, there are some algae groups that are now considered to be part of Kingdom Plantae, okay? Now, we're not necessarily going to go into algae specifically. We are going to focus on what we call embryophytes, and this is going to be our land plants. So there could be some other members of Kingdom Plantae, but we're only going to be focusing on the ones that are your land plants. So what makes the land plants kind of special? What are some of those adaptations that they have? And we'll look at some of these as we go into structures. But they have a cuticle, which is a waxy layer on the outside. They have stomata, which are the little holes under their leaves that help them take gases in and release oxygen. They have protection. Okay, one of the things that we're going to see over and over and over is protection. So they have protected gametes in gametangia. They have protected embryos. Okay, so the embryos are protected. They have pigments to protect them from UV radiation. They have spores, which are going to be protected by these thick walls. And then we also have some mutualistic relationships. And this is one of the things we looked at back with fungi. We had the mycorrhiza, and so that's going to be something that can help them absorb water better and grow better. Now this is something that I want to spend a few minutes on because this is something that kind of applies to your essay. So the essays for plants, there's one about a guy who was important for saving the wine industry. And there's one that's a moss life cycle, okay? Now, a plant's life cycle consists of 2 multicellular stages, okay? And we looked at this very briefly back with meiosis, but they go through a process called alternation of generations. They alternate between these 2 stages, a gametophyte and a sporophyte. And so all of our land plants, from mosses to ferns to flowering plants to conifers, they all go through this multicellular stage life cycle. So they have a multicellular gametophyte and they have a multicellular sporophyte. And when you're labeling that moss life cycle, if you understand alternation of generations, it makes it a lot easier to understand the words that you're labeling on that life cycle. So first off, your gametophyte is a haploid structure that produces gametes. So this part should be pretty easy. The gametophyte produces gametes. We know that gametes are egg and sperm, and typically your gametes are going to be haploid. Okay, so that should hopefully be easy for you to remember. Now, a lot of times these gametophytes are within or hidden somewhere in the other stage called the sporophyte. In your more advanced plants, one of those adaptations was that they have these protected gametophytes. So they protect their gamete structures. Now, just like we have ovaries and testes, the testes produce the sperm, the ovaries produce the egg. We kind of have different male and female structures. The same thing is going to apply to these plants. So we have Archegonia and Antheridia. I say them like that because that's how I remember them, and that Archegonia, egg, okay, e.g., your Archegonia are the ones that produce the eggs. They're going to be your female gametophytes. And then your Anther, okay, has the sound. Your Antheridia is going to produce the sperm, and that's going to be your male gametophyte. Now the sporophyte is the diploid stage, so this would be after those gametes come together in fertilization, and the sporophyte produces spores. So once again, this should kind of be easy to remember. The gametophyte produces gametes, the sporophyte produces spores. Now, for the most part, there's one exception, and that's the mosses, but for the most part, when you look outside at a plant, when you're looking at the tree, when you are looking at the flower, when you are looking at the grass or the bush, whatever it is, most of the plants that you see outside, what you are seeing is the sporophyte. You are seeing that diploid stage that produces spores. Once again, we can have kind of male and female versions. You have mega and microspores. So the mega means big, micro means small. And so for a second, I want you to think about egg and sperm, okay? Even though these are not producing the egg and sperm, these are going to give rise to those gametophyte structures. So eggs are way bigger than sperm are, okay? So the mega would be the female, all right? And sperm are little, they're tinier than your egg. So the micro is going to go with the male, okay? So your female are going to be your Archegonia, that's your female gametophyte. And then your sporophyte is going to produce megaspores that will become that female gametophyte, all right? Then your Antheridia are going to be your male gametophytes that produce the sperm. And then your microspores will be the spores that will develop into the Antheridia, okay? All right, so let's take a look at this life cycle. Once again, this is kind of like what you're going to see on that moss life cycle where you have to label it. It's just going to be specific to the moss group. But you're going to see the same basic process, okay? So there really isn't necessarily a starting point, but I'm going to start up here with that gametophyte, okay? So we know the gametophyte is haploid, and the gametophyte is going to produce haploid spores, okay? So the gametophyte produces the egg and sperm. Now, I want you to think for a minute about cell division, okay? Mitosis is a division that keeps things the same in terms of chromosome number, and meiosis is going to be a division that turns those chromosomes into half, right? It halves the chromosome number. So if your gametophyte is haploid and it's producing egg and sperm, it's going to be producing haploid cells by mitosis. And this is a little bit different than what we're used to because we're normally thinking egg and sperm produced by meiosis. Well, in this case, the gametophyte is haploid. It's producing haploid sperm and haploid egg. So we would have a mitotic division going on here, okay? Now, the egg and sperm are going to come together just like they have to form a human. When egg and sperm come together, that's fertilization, and that's going to produce a diploid zygote, okay? So that diploid zygote is going to go through cell division, and that's going to lead to that sporophyte, which is diploid. So once again, we have a diploid zygote going to a diploid sporophyte, diploid to diploid. We're going to see mitotic divisions happening here, okay? Now here is where we're going to see our meiosis happening, and this is different from an animal life cycle. So here you have a diploid sporophyte, but the diploid sporophyte is going to be producing haploid spores. So if I'm going from haploid to diploid, that is going to have to be a meiotic division, so you can see meiosis there, okay? And then these spores, which are haploid, are going to divide by mitosis to produce that haploid gametophyte. So here's what you need to understand. Your haploid gametophyte produces haploid gametes. Your gametes will fuse to form the zygote, which is diploid. The diploid zygote will become the diploid sporophyte. And like I said, for most plants, this is what you're looking at when you see the plant. The sporophyte will go through meiosis to produce the spores, and then the spores will divide to form the gametophyte, and the cycle continues. All right, so now we're going to get into the diversity in the plants, okay? And so we're going to look at 4 main plant phyla. Remember, we have kingdom, phylum, class. Now, I'm going to give you a second. I'm going to pause here for a moment because I would highly encourage you to somewhere on your notes, draw this little cladogram, okay? Because a lot of what you need to know is going to be summed up in this one little diagram. And if you remember how to read a cladogram, you can remember that it kind of goes from farther back in time to newer, right? So oldest to newest. And then as we see these new traits emerge, anything that comes after it is going to have those traits, okay? So up here we have mosses, ferns, conifers, and flowering plants. Now, these are the words that go with those, okay? Your bryophytes are your mosses, so you might want to write that word on the diagram as well. Your pteridophytes are your ferns. Your gymnosperms are your conifers, and your angiosperms are your flowering plants, okay? More than likely, you're going to see these on a test over these, okay? So you might want to go ahead and add those onto your chart as well. And so let's just kind of take a look at mosses for a second. Before we've even talked about them, we can look and we can see that mosses are kind of the oldest of our land plants. These are going to be the ones that are most like those algae ancestors. And we can see that they're lacking some pretty important plant structures. So they're lacking vascular tissue. They don't have it. They're lacking seeds. They're lacking flowers. Okay? So a lot of times mosses are referred to non-vascular plants. Okay? We can see that one step up on that evolutionary ladder, the ferns have vascular tissue, but they don't have seeds and flowers. We can see that when we move up to conifers, they have seeds. And I want you to add something here, okay? In addition to seeds, I want you to put and pollen, all right? So pollen is kind of a protective casing for the plant sperm. And so we have kind of increased protection for reproductive success. And the seed is a protected embryo. So once again, we see a lot about protection in terms of evolutionary trends. And so for the conifers, I want you to put seeds and pollen because everything after that will have both seeds and pollen. And I want you to notice these words that end in sperms. Both of those are plant groups that produce pollen grains, okay? And then our final group are flowering plants, or our angiosperms. They have both flowers, and once again, I want you to add something here. They have flowers and fruits, okay? So mosses are non-vascular. Ferns are vascular, but they don't have seeds or flowers. Conifers have seeds and pollen, and then flowering plants have flowers, fruits, and all of the above, okay? So if you kind of write those things in, or put this diagram in your notes, you kind of have an overview of everything that we're about to talk about. So we're going to start with our bryophytes, which are commonly called mosses. Okay, once again, one of the things that sets them apart is they are non-vascular. In this lesson, as well as other lessons, we're going to talk about this vascular tissue. You probably remember the terms xylem and phloem from freshman biology. And vascular always refers to vessels. Like we have a cardiovascular system, and our vascular portion is the veins and arteries that carry the blood. And hopefully you know that the purpose of those veins and arteries is to transport. So once again, vascular tissue in a plant is also going to be a transport tissue. So here's the deal, mosses don't have them. Mosses don't have that xylem and phloem. They don't have those transport tissues, which is why they are small and they're very close to the ground, because there's not a way for the food and the water to travel long distance, okay? So you will also always find them near water. Because they don't have pollen grains, they simply release their sperm into water, and they're going to rely on basic osmosis to move water throughout the cells, and they're going to rely on basic diffusion to move food substances and other particles from one part of the plant to the other. And so the fact that they're non-vascular is pretty significant, okay? You're never going to see a tall moss. Now, I do want to clarify something. You may have heard of something called Spanish moss before. And Spanish moss you can find growing up into tall trees. Spanish moss is not a moss, okay? Spanish moss is actually an angiosperm, a flowering plant. So that's why it can grow tall up into those trees. Now, your bryophytes are also special in that they are the only group where they have a dominant gametophyte. Most of the time when you're looking at a moss, you're looking at the gametophyte, and only during certain times will you see that sporophyte present, okay? All the other plant groups are going to have a dominant sporophyte. So there's group number one. Our next group, moving up on that evolutionary ladder, we have our pteridophytes, or our ferns. And these guys are going to be seedless vascular plants, okay? Now what that means is they don't have a protected embryo. They're still going to have egg and sperm come together to make a baby fern, but that baby's not going to be protected inside of a seed coat, okay? This is also the first group to have true roots and leaves. This is the first group to have a dominant sporophyte, but they don't have pollen. Remember, we added that to our cladogram. If you don't have pollen, the sperm have to be released into water. So once again, your ferns are going to have to be in either environments that have moisture, or they're going to have to be near a body of water. Okay, they're going to have to at least have droplets of water in order to reproduce. So you won't find ferns or mosses growing in dry environments. All right, the next step up on the evolutionary ladder are your gymnosperms. These are the ones we commonly call our conifers. These are our naked seeded plants, okay? So they have vascular tissue, they have seeds, but their seeds are not protected, okay? So they have a protected embryo in a seed, but they don't have further protection for their seeds. We do see pollen here, and the significance of pollen is they can release it by air. You no longer have to have water for fertilization. They have cones, okay? So gymnosperms are naked seeded plants with cones, and the most common are the conifers, like pine trees like we see around here, or your cypress trees, things like that. I don't know if I think I just said that wrong. Not your cypress. I'm going blank. Maybe I did say it right. Now there's some other ones that we probably aren't as familiar with, like the ginkgo tree, the cycads, the cnidophytes. But for the most part, when you think about gymnosperms, I want you to think about your conifers. All right, last and final group. Now, super important, look at this number. Over 90% of all plant species still around today are going to be angiosperms, and they are by far and wide the most successful. And it's because they have the most traits and the most adaptations to help them have reproductive success, okay? So normally when you're looking outside, the majority of the plants that you're looking at are going to be angiosperms. Your grasses are angiosperms. your bushes are going to be angiosperms. A lot of your trees are going to be angiosperms. And even if you don't see visible flowers, a lot of those plants outside are going to be flowering plants. So they have it all. They're vascular. They have that transport tissue. They have the seeds, which is the protected embryo, but they also have further protection, okay? These ovaries that they have are going to ripen and produce a fruit, okay? So notice that a fruit is a mature ovary, and the purpose of a fruit is to protect those seeds. They also produce pollen, so they no longer require water for fertilization, like those gymnosperms, and so they are the most successful because they have the most adaptations for reproductive success. We have protection, protection, and protection. Now typically we take these and we split them into two groups. You have your monocots and your dicots. Just a few things to point out. They come from the word cotyledon. A monocot has one cotyledon. You'll see that like in a corn kernel. A dicot has two cotyledons. Okay, a cotyledon is a seed leaf, and you find that in the little seed. If you look at their roots, they have vascular bundles arranged differently. If you look at the stem, their vascular bundles are arranged differently. If you look at the leaf, their veins are different. If you look at the flowers, you can count the flower parts. We're actually going to dissect a flower, and we'll take a look at that and kind of determine if it's a monocot or a dicot. So some of the advantages of the seed plants, and seed plants are your gymnosperms and angiosperms. So the seed is a protected embryo, and in that seed is food for that embryo. Their gametophytes are usually hidden within a protective structure like cones or flowers, which means it protects the formation of those gametes. They produce the two spores, the female and the male. They have ovules, which are going to become the seed and protect. And then they have the fruits, which are also going to protect if it's an angiosperm. They have pollen, and so once again the pollen allows no need for water, okay? So you eliminate that need. You don't have to have water to fertilize. It's pollen season right now. Pollen is everywhere. Everything's covered in a dust of yellow, and we know that they can spread far and wide by wind, in the air, in the water. So it kind of it just expands that reproduction ability. They can also disperse those seeds in a variety of ways, and seed dispersal just increases success because it's going to reduce competition. It's going to allow them to grow in further distances, and we know that seeds can be dispersed in a variety of methods. All right, so now we're going to take a quick shift. I know this is a long set of notes. I'm going to try to speed it up a little bit here. But now we're going to talk about some of your main plant parts. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail. I'm going to try to go quickly, and that's because you've been learning these things since you were in elementary school. Now, I do want to take this back to the organization of life, and that we have organ systems that are made up of organs. We have organs that are made up of tissues, and we have tissues that are made up of cells. And so normally if I would ask you name an organ, you would probably say something in our body like a heart or a liver. But just like our bodies are organized, cell, tissue, organ system, plants are organized in the same way, okay? Now this is not on your notes, but there are two main systems in plants. All right, we're gonna have one that's called the shoot system. And the shoot system is essentially everything that is above the ground. It's going to be your stems and your leaves and any other structures that you'll find, like fruits possibly. And then you have your root system, okay? So there's two main systems in plants, root system and shoot system. Okay, root system is down here, shoot system is up here. Now, these systems are made up of organs. So your root system primarily consists of roots. They anchor, they absorb, they store. Your stems are part of your shoot system. They're above the ground. They're going to help transport. They're going to contain that vascular tissue. They're also going to display those leaves to collect sunlight, and they're going to provide structure. And then we have leaves, which are all about photosynthesis and making food and collecting sunlight. And that's also going to be where we see that gas exchange. So our root system is going to consist of roots. And then our shoot system is going to consist of stems, leaves, and possibly other parts like flowers and fruits. All right, so these organs are going to be made up of tissues, and we're going to take a look at 4 tissue types. The first one is dermal. Now we have dermal tissue, and hopefully you know that derm equals skin. So the dermal tissue of the plant is kind of like the skin on our bodies. It's an outer layer, okay, called an epidermis, just like what we've got. Now, outside of that dermal tissue, you might find a cuticle. Now, this would only be on the shoot system, but a cuticle is not a living layer. It's just a waxy layer that kind of holds water in. This is one of those adaptations of land plants. A thicker cuticle you'll typically find in areas that are drier. Another tissue is the vascular tissue, which we've already kind of talked about a little bit. Vascular tissue is all about transport. We have xylem, which carries water, and phloem, which carries food. Okay, we'll talk about that more in plant transport. And then we have ground tissue, which is a filler. Okay, so we have dermal on the outside. We have vascular tissue on the inside. It creates veins. And so the tissue between the veins and dermal tissue is called the ground. Okay, if it's inside the vascular tissue, it's the pith. If it's outside the vascular tissue, it's called the cortex. So here's just a picture of your xylem and phloem. Now, one of the things that we're going to talk about are some cells, but we didn't really talk about cells here, but within your xylem and phloem, there are specialized cells. So notice there's sieve cells, there's tracheids, okay? So we know that cells make up tissues, which make up organs, which make up organ systems. So these tissues are going to be made up of specialized cells as well, okay? All right, our fourth tissue is going to be meristematic, or your meristems, and I want you to remember that meristems equal mitosis. Meristems equal mitosis. This is where we have growth. Now there's two types of growth in plants. We have primary, and primary growth is going to be growing up and growing down, okay? So the shoots are going to get taller and the roots are going to get deeper, and this is going to occur at what we call apical meristems. Now, apical comes from the word apex, which means tip. So your apical meristems are going to be at the tips of roots and shoots, and this allows those shoots to grow taller to get more sunlight. That's called apical dominance. Typically, the plant wants to grow taller to get closer to the sun. And then it's also going to allow those roots to grow deeper to get more water and nutrients and all of those things, okay? So primary growth is going to allow for length, and then secondary growth is going to be in width, okay? So if you think about tree rings in a tree, that's an example of secondary growth. And that's going to occur at lateral meristems. The word lateral means on the side, and so this is going to allow that side-to-side growth to make your trunks thicker, your stems wider. And both of these are going to come from these embryonic tissues, but essentially meristems equal mitosis, and this is where the plant's going to grow. So there's some pictures. This is a picture of an apical meristem. Now, if you think back to first semester, we did a mitosis lab where you looked at the tips of onion roots. And so what you were looking at was an apical meristem in a plant. And that was the reason we could see the different stages of mitosis. If we would have looked further up from that tip, we would not have seen those various stages. So we know that mitosis happens in those apical meristems at the tips of roots and shoots. All right, so here's a few different types of cells. Now these are cells that you can find in ground tissue, that filler tissue. We have parenchyma, collenchyma, and sclerenchyma. I have a really dumb way to remember these, but your parenchyma, I try to connect it with pee and photosynthesis because they are where you find most of your metabolism. These are very abundant, especially in the leaves, okay? But this is where you have a lot of your metabolism. These are your very much living and functional cells. They do a lot of photosynthesis, a lot of cellular respiration. Now your collenchyma are found in growing portions. They're more of like a support cell. And so I remember, this is dumb, like I said, but I remember that my collar is growing, okay? My collar is growing. So the collenchyma are going to be in the growing portions. And then sclerenchyma, there's a part of your eye called the sclera. And so I remember that my sclera is old, okay? So they're found in mature parts of the plant. They're really not growing. They're not necessarily metabolic, okay? They're not really even living. They're mostly going to be for strength. So we have parenchyma, which are highly metabolic, most abundant. The collenchyma, which are in the growing regions for support. And the sclerenchyma, which are going to be in mature parts that are kind of old. And it's really all about support and strength. All right, a few other specialized parts of plants that you might want to know in terms of adaptations. So for the root, we have root hairs, which are going to increase surface area. Remember, anytime you have extensions or foldings, it increases surface area. In this case, it allows for better absorption. We have a root cap. Remember, we have this apical meristem down here, this zone of cell division, and we wouldn't want all those new baby cells being damaged as that root pushed through the soil. Remember, the roots are going to be moving downward. And so as it pushes down into the soil, we have this root cap, which is kind of a hard structure that's going to protect these baby cells that are being made right here. On the leaves, we have the blade, which is the big flat section, the petiole, which is actually the stalk that attaches it to the stem. We have an important middle layer tissue known as the mesophyll. This is where you have a lot of photosynthesis taking place. And something I want to point out in this picture, I know it's not the best picture there, but this palisade layer and this spongy layer, both of these have the parenchymal cells. There's palisade parenchyma and spongy parenchyma. So remember, those highly metabolic cells are what are making up these two layers here in this mesophyll. So that's where you have most of your photosynthesis happening. Another really important structure in plants are your stomata. They're on the underside of leaves, and they're surrounded by guard cells. When the guard cells fill up with water, they buckle and the stomata opens. That allows oxygen and carbon dioxide to be exchanged. Now the only issue is that when they're open, they can also lose water by transpiration. And so one of the evolutionary mechanisms that the plants have to deal with is they have to leave their stomata open to get gases, but they don't want to leave it open too much because that can lead to water loss. So you see some adaptations with plants in dry areas in regards to their stomata. On the stems, you have the nodes and internodes where the leaves attach and then the spaces between them. You have buds, which are those new tissues that are going to grow. Sometimes your stems have the wood type material. It depends on the type of plant. And the wood is just different layers of xylem that have been put in over time. And then we have the flower. We're going to dissect a flower. We're going to talk about reproduction in your angiosperms and kind of look at these parts again. I would definitely know the parts of the flower in terms of the diagram as well as what they do. So the sepals are these little green leaves down here. They aren't always green, but this is the part that encloses the bud. So when you see a flower bud before it blooms, those outermost layers that kind of close that in are called the sepals. The petals are all about attracting pollinators. That's why they're normally colorful or they have a smell. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not good. Now the stamen is the male part. Okay, so this whole thing here is a stamen, and you can see that there's multiple stamen there on that flower. The filament holds up the anther, and the anther is where the pollen's produced. Remember antheridia? So anther is the sperm producer. Okay, so for the flowering plants, the anther makes the pollen. So like when the bees brush up against the flower, they collect that pollen from those anthers. And then the carpel or the pistil is the female part. And so this is going to be this whole structure here. There's three parts to that pistil. We have the ovary, which houses the ovules. Okay, those ovules will become the seeds. The ovary will become the fruit. We have the style, which connects to the stigma at the top. So the stigma is sticky. That's where the pollen will land and stick, and then it travels down that style down into the ovary, fertilizes the eggs and the ovules, and that's how we get the seeds, and then later this will become the fruit. So I would definitely take a look at your flower because we're going to see it again. And that is going to wrap up our first lesson in plants. I know that was a lot. That used to be 2 lessons, but just for time purposes, we try to condense, and I try to make it into a smaller amount of lessons. So instead of 5, we're going to have 3. So that's going to be all for today. I hope you guys enjoy your break, and I will see you soon. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns. See y'all later.